So, what will you get out of this session? What can you expect to get out of this session? First, you will identify some strategies to engage your students in your synchronous learning time, in their synchronous learning time. You will be able to choose from features available in most virtual meeting platforms to best execute said strategy. So we do say most because we are here using Teams, and we will be mentioning, where relevant, some of the key differences in the other Waterloo supported virtual meeting platforms. And finally, you will be able to distinguish the purpose and merits of each platform shared for your effective synchronous class delivery. All right, so we're going to begin now with our first scenario, and this has to do with bookending, or how you begin a lesson, and at the end we'll return to bookending and talk about sort of wrapping up. So the scenario here is, as students sign on to our synchronous sessions, I feel like there's a missed opportunity to engage students right away or to help them foster peer-to-peer relationships. So in these situations, one of the features and strategies that you can use is something similar to how we opened our own time here together. Now, as you all experienced, there were some hiccups with that in hearing the sound. It appeared that there were some different ways that folks could enable the sound on their end. So just a reminder that even when you do check that these things work ahead of time, as Monica and I did, you can come in, across some hiccups. So as Monica pointed out in the chat, you're able to help each other out, as your students will. And once you kind of get the ball rolling, it will get smoother and smoother in your sessions. You could also post a riddle or puzzle for students to solve either collaboratively or independently, so more like a static image. The point just being that it gives them something to do in the time, something to work on together without committing to some of the more awkward type icebreakers of really getting to know each other at that point. And something else that you can use to get a synchronous session started is to use polls. So using a closed-ended question by having students discuss real-time results in the chat, and then you can return to this when you are formally beginning the session, and this works especially well if you can connect it to the topic of your session for that day. And we are going to demonstrate a poll for you in an upcoming scenario, so that's why you're not seeing anything on this slide. So our next scenario then is discussions, and discussions are a lot of what the synchronous time ends up being used for. So our scenario here is, I like to ask my class questions during our synchronous time together. How can I create greater engagement and move beyond the use of standard chat responses? So in our experience, in many of the situations I talk to instructors about, students seem very comfortable using the chat to answer questions, but you may be looking for ways to draw them away from that space or to use that space differently for interaction. So a feature that is offered in all of these platforms is the chat itself, and it can be used in a lot of ways. So one way is to do something called a chat storm, or the enter key is lava. And this is when students write their responses to a prompt in the chat. But importantly, they do not click enter until you say go. As Derek Bruff notes, it's actually somewhat difficult to not press enter because we're so trained to do that after writing a response in the chat. So you can remind students, don't press enter, and just know that there might be a couple of hiccups along the way as everyone gets used to these features and strategies. But we do recommend preparing an open-ended prompt for the chat storm, and that is because it works well to follow up the chat storm with a poll. And in the poll, you will use a closed-ended question for students to respond to, as polls just lend themselves better to closed-ended questions. And then using what you've seen in the chat storm, using what you have in the poll, you can go back into the discussion. And it gives every student a way to participate. And we are going to demonstrate both of these things together, or with you. So I'm going to begin by reminding you that don't press enter until I count down to, or say 3, 2, 1, and then I'll say go to enter your response. So the chat storm prompt is, how much time should be incorporated into a synchronous session to pause to read the chat? So remember, you're going to type into the chat, but you're not going to press enter. And Maddie has asked a really great question in the chat about how many students does this work for? So do answer from the perspective of the classes that you have. And we'll see how that kind of affects how your answers come across in this question. How much time should be incorporated into a synchronous session to pause to read the chat? If you have 75 plus students, you might need some more time or some more strategies for knowing that you're going to get that number of responses from your students. It could be only students with last names that start with A through F are going to do it this time, or something like that. So I'm going to stop talking for about 30 seconds, let you get your answer in the chat, and then I'll let you know when to press enter. All right. So in 3, 2, 1, go. Press enter. All right, that worked really well. Things are just popping up now. Everybody's jumping in and taking some time to answer from their perspective. So going back to Maddie's question and reflecting on how many folks are joining us here today, which we have about 40, which is so great to have all of you here with us. We can see there is a large variety of responses, including some of those, well, it depends on, etc. So this is really great, because then you could consider for yourself how much time you might want to set aside for scanning the chat storm, for scanning the chat if it's regularly used in your class, whether you have a TA monitoring it, etc., etc. And we're going to now move on to our poll, which Monica has set up. And you'll see how you can knit together the chat with the poll so that they're playing off of each other rather than being sort of separate stilted pieces.
Thanks very much, Victoria. So we're going to dive right in. I've just placed a link to a poll in the chat, and I'm going to ask you to access that poll and respond to it. It has 4 options for responding, and I'll give you 2 minutes to consider the poll question. So it looks like we have a majority of our responses in, and we already have some brilliant questions in the chat. So let me just turn to them right away and start addressing them. So definitely for the polls, it is true that there's a couple of different ways within Microsoft Teams to, pardon me, I just had a, there we go. There's a couple of different ways in Microsoft Teams to access the polling features. So what we're going to do, though, is to walk through how polling as an activity can be actually accessed in the different platforms, because often looking at it in situ gives you a better sense of how it appears from the instructor side. So our first environment that we're going to examine is the Bongo Virtual Classroom. And this is what appears in Bongo for you to select a poll right within the session itself. And so what you see is that it's clearly available in the set of instructions, control features that you have on hand within the virtual classroom. And the way that it's set up here is that the responses are pre-formatted as a yes, no, A, B, or such a diversity of different options. The custom poll option at the bottom that you will see in Bongo actually means that you're able to customize responses. In none of the cases are you able to indicate the question as a part of the poll within the Bongo Virtual Classroom, because in Bongo it's really more intended to be something that is more spontaneous and generated within the session, sort of in the spur of the moment. And so you'll have to think about how you share the question. Is it verbal? But as you know, it's always good practice to make sure that you also share the text of the question. So that could be done in a chat, or it could be done as a part of your presentation. The next platform that we do support at Waterloo is WebEx, and this is the kind of interface that you will see here. First of all, you need to, in WebEx, ensure that your polling panel has in fact been added, so that you have launched it prior to doing your session so that it's available to you. Within WebEx, in fact, you are able to control a lot of the features of the poll. You can pre-create the poll, or you can create it within the session. So this is a bit of an expansion to what we have available in Bongo. And if you've pre-created it, it's the second window that allows you to open the actual poll that you've set up. Finally, to start addressing some of the questions that were in the chat as you were thinking ahead, absolutely true that within MS Teams, if you've added forms as an app, you can access it right there in your Teams meeting, and you can create the poll right then and there. That is definitely one option. The other option is the approach that we took, which was to use the Forms application that appears in your Office 365 suite of apps and generate the poll in that space. Both have their advantages, certainly. One of the really interesting things about using Forms as a polling tool, though, is that it has a broader range of features available. So here we're using it as a poll tool, but it can also be used as a survey tool or as a quiz tool, for example, if you want to do pre and post quizzing in your classroom and you want to show live results. So that's another way that you might want to do it or bring it into the classroom. So there are lots of different things to consider when looking at the polling as a strategy versus the tool available to you within a platform. Ultimately, because all of our platforms do have screen sharing, any tool that you're comfortable with and you like the features of can be used within any of the 3 platforms available to us. Victoria, have I omitted any questions in the chat? Just anything you noticed?
Nope, I think you either answered them aloud or we've been able to cover them in the chat.
Okay, smashing. Thank you for keeping an eye on that. Right now, what we'd really like to do is a quick little check-in with you to see how you're managing with the pace of the workshop that we have so far, because we know that some folks will come in with a lot of knowledge on one subject area and not on another. So we wanted to make sure that we had a way that we could check in with you. So right now what we're going to ask you to do is to respond to a couple of GIFs that we're going to put into the chat. And the way that we're going to ask you to respond is by taking advantage of the reaction features that are available within MS Teams. So you'll see here we have an illustration of the reactions that are possible, the thumbs up, heart, surprise, laugh out loud, whichever one you'd like to use. So if you'd like to now take the opportunity to look at the GIFs that Victoria is putting in the chat and respond as you see fit to the 2 of them available.
And we have found that if you're using the browser or internet version of Teams, you may only see the link and not the GIF under the link. And if you're using the desktop version of Teams, which we highly recommend if you're able to use that, you should see both the GIF and the link together. You can also copy and paste GIFs into the chat so that all that you would see is the GIF itself. Again, that worked in practice, and I'm not sure why it's not happening right now. It might just be an internet slow thing, but it's just not allowing me to paste the GIF like I would paste an image at this time.
All right. I think we're just going to pause it there then and share with you the scenario that sort of brought this to our minds. So, of course, we wanted to check in with you in real time just to see how folks were experiencing things. And we're seeing a diversity of responses. So some folks just on board, pace is great, everything is good. Others, well, perhaps this is coming at quite a number of different, from quite a number of different angles at a quicker pace than they anticipated. So we'll really try to manage that and make sure that we're paying attention closely to what you're providing us in the chat in terms of any concerns that you may have. The scenario here that we're really trying to attend to is my students and I miss the nonverbal cues that we used to get in the classroom. So how can I offer ways of sense making to my students that is something different, something alternate, something embellished and additional, something that'll help me to get at that piece that I can't see when I'm in the synchronous online mode? And how can I also accommodate my students' different social needs and learning preferences in doing so? So some of the features and strategies we've started to demonstrate here. Certainly one of them is using images in the chat, images or GIFs in the chat for folks to respond to, and availing yourself really of the features of the platform that you're in. So in this case, in MS Teams, the reactions that are available for use. It doesn't have to be the instructor, or in our case, the facilitator that shares those images. It can, in fact, be the students that share them, and you can take turns with that as well. Another piece that we'd like you to maybe think about is the potential for visual organization. So within this platform, within MS Teams, some of the ones you might be familiar with are Miro or Jamboard, and we could use those to share and collect input. So when it comes to visual organization, really the best way to examine these is by giving you visual examples. So we have coming up just some examples, not the way of doing things, but templates that are available. So to begin with then, as we mentioned, Miro being one of the possible tools within MS Teams that we're in right now. And so one of the ways you might use this is almost as a chart. So here's an example of a visual interaction collaborative opportunity in Miro that has 2 axes, 2 dimensions, and students are encouraged to contribute to it through these stickies that they can put information on and position in a certain location on this chart. Another example might be Google Jamboard. In this case, I'm giving another contrasting example. 2 columns in this case, with even images being the labels for the 2 columns, and then the stickies on the bottom are available for students to take up, put a name on, and then locate in the correct column that they wish. I do want to say that these are just 2 examples, by no means the typical way of using these 2 applications. So they're just exemplars, so you can start to get a sense of how you can use a visual representation to collect and organize information. It should be noted that both Miro and Jamboard do describe themselves as sort of online collaborative whiteboards, but the 2 do have quite a different set of features available to you. Certainly Jamboard, very quick on the uptake, very easy to put into use, but it is simpler. It doesn't have quite the robust number of features that Miro does. On the other hand, Miro, if you really want to take full advantage of it, it is a much more sophisticated tool that has many more things available for use. And now, one more example that happens to be one that's near and dear to the hearts of both Victoria and myself is Padlet, another tool that's available online that does have a lot of interesting templates to take advantage of. One version of the templates allows you to take basically stickies and put them in columns. And what's really interesting about these individual post-it type stickies is that they can contain text, they can contain static images, they can be dynamic images, and they can contain audio files as well. So there's a lot of potential for how you can organize and gather data here. Another format that's templated within Padlet is the geographic organization of information. Here, for example, I've shown one of those points as being expanded, and when you expand that little dialog box, you can again include additional images, text, and audio. Finally, a very interesting template that's available in Padlet is something they refer to as a timeline. The example that I've chosen to show you here, though, is using that timeline as a distance measure, the planets away from the sun. So as you move out away from the sun, they describe all of the planets, both giving a visual image. You can see that within the box, you can include a visual, you can include text. Once again, audio is also possible. Interesting about this timeline feature, as the name implied, you can use it for a chronological ordering of things, distance, as this application shows, or a value, a continuum. So you can be talking about the importance of something or its relationship, how closely it's related to something. So lots of opportunity for interaction there visually. And that's a rather nice segue to talking about something else that is quite important in the synchronous meetings, and that is this idea of having smaller group discussions. It already actually came up in response to the pause time when we were chatting about how much time do you need to give folks to read the chat, and already folks started talking about, oh, I'd have to break my group up into smaller numbers. And so the scenario, in fact, that we are trying to address here is I'd like to foster that exchange of ideas as a part of a course experience. So how can I encourage that small group discussion and collaboration in those big classes? A natural go-to is breakout rooms, and in fact, that is something that is available in all of the platforms that we support on campus. To allow you to have sort of a first-hand experience of this, we have in fact set up breakout rooms for this session, and we're going to give you 5 minutes to consider some prompts that we've selected for your groups that are related to this online synchronous experience. And then we're going to invite you back into the main space, and we're going to have an opportunity to unpack the experience, both from the perspective of the user, that is to say from the student perspective, but also how might you think about this as an instructor. I'm now going to pass that magic wand of the organizer over to Brianna, because it is only the organizer that can actually set up the breakout rooms in MS Teams. I might draw attention just before we go into our breakout rooms to some of the questions around these apps that we're showcasing and the availability of these apps to our students. So definitely thank you for answering one another's questions. Yes, all of these are freely available to us within the O365 suite of apps that we have on campus.
Great. I've left us all in this room now. So I'm going to pop into each room and add the chat messages. So just give me a moment.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brianna.
Folks are coming back slowly. Here they come.
All right. Hi, guys.
Welcome back, everyone. And with plus 35 people, I think we're all back, Monica.
We're all home. Excellent. All right. So how was that lovely chaotic experience out in breakout room land? What we have here was an experience that was based on a standalone Microsoft Teams meeting, which is quite distinct from having a roster linked experience where you have a group of people that are already pre-populated in a team. So in this case, one of the features that was not available to setting up these breakout rooms is the opportunity to pre-populate those breakout rooms. So it's good to know this in advance to have a sense of how it's going to feel. So you've just now had the opportunity to experience it from that student side and the student experience. And we want you to consider some questions when you consider that student experience. First of all, did everyone turn on their cameras? And for those folks that didn't, did they have a personalized display? Are these things you'd like to encourage with folks in the space? Because it might lead to a more engaging and personalized interaction. We randomly set up ours at around 5 people per little group for a breakout room. How did that feel? How was that for you in that space? So these are the types of things you want to be considering in the big picture as you just step back and look at the use of breakout rooms in general. And then, of course, the other side that we want to share with you is what do you have in control as an instructor? And so for that, we're going to share with you some screen captures so that you see how the space looks. And we're going to once again look at those platforms that we do support on campus. So in Bongo, the virtual classroom, you see that the controls are right there on your panel and readily available. One of the features that unfortunately is not available in Bongo Virtual Classroom is this ability to broadcast out or to announce out to speak to all of your breakout rooms at the same time. So the workaround in Bongo is to keep your primary space open and to put chat messages in that space and have your students refer back to it. But this is something you will have to guide them to do. Bearing in mind, Bongo has a user maximum of 150. It has a number of rooms that you can create, capped at 8. WebEx, here's what you would see in that type of interface, the various settings that you have control over. In WebEx, you are able to communicate with all of your breakout rooms, and it is referred to as broadcasting in that platform. Here, the number of maximum users is 1,000, so not surprisingly, the number of breakout rooms is also greatly increased, and it happens to be capped at 100. Our current space is the space we really wanted to speak about, so you can create breakout rooms within a meeting, following that arrow here, that little symbol, quite small in the visual, and then this is what you would see as instructor. This is what was made available to Brianna. She was putting you into groups, and she was not able to do the automatic piece because if this is a single meeting where people joined through a link, we did not have people directly invited to the meeting, and so we could not pre-populate them into groups. However, that aside, there are many advantages to potentially having these breakout room meetings in Teams, and one of them is that opportunity to pre-populate if they are in the group. And so when you do that, that means if you set reoccurring meetings, those breakout room setups don't have to be redone. They continue to exist for subsequent reoccurring meetings. Really important to note that it is the organizer that has the control both over creating and managing the room. So the communications, those had to be done by Brianna because she had organized the space. So this is a really good showcase of where that can be an obstacle if you organize your class differently. Very also important to note that within the breakout room itself, though, in MS Teams, everyone now has equal status. So regardless of whether or not you were just an attendee in the main space, once you get into the breakout room space, you do have access to the various features within that space. It's also a good point to contrast those standalone meetings from the Teams situation in the sense that you can also capture your conversations differently. All breakout room meetings will have the chat retained, so you can return to it, so that's not going anywhere. But for example, in your small groups, you might have captured some of your key ideas with the use of a note taker. Somebody may have created some notes. Those notes will reside with that person in their SharePoint space. Whereas if you are in a team, a roster synced team, you can use wikis. Wikis now become available to you, and those wikis can reside as an app. You can put them in your tab, for example, across the control at the top of your team space, and then the whole class has access to that information. So that is a distinction that can be really valuable if you want everyone to be able to come back to the discussions that were had. You'll see there's a big caveat at the bottom of this slide in yellow, and this is super important to note because this can be a trip-up point, which is to say that groups that are created in Learn in our LMS do not transfer over to any of the platforms. They do not transfer over to Bongo, Virtual Classroom, MS Teams, or WebEx. Now what we're going to do is to give you the opportunity in this whiteboard discussion to actually share out with the group what you chatted about in your individual breakout rooms. And here the scenario that we're examining is this opportunity for small groups that have had good, robust discussions to share back and summarize those discussions and share them out to the full group. And how do we encourage that in a low stakes sharing way with a large class? So we've already addressed sort of the benefits of a roster team. If you have that, then you can share those thoughts and ideas and capture them in a wiki, and everyone can access that information. Another way to approach this is through the use of a whiteboard.
So we're going to have a chance to play now with the whiteboard, and what we'd like you to do, hopefully you had a chance to choose a representative from your group, because we are a large group. We're recognizing that if we have 40 people trying to work on the whiteboard at once, it might become a little bit too chaotic. So this is a way to make that a little bit easier. And something else to note about using the whiteboard is it's kind of fun and interesting and a good break, but it's not necessarily in a state yet where you can, you know, draw perfectly or write super clearly, or things pop up exactly timed really nicely. So just a recommendation at this point in the development of whiteboards in general, maybe using it for kind of like a fun break activity, as opposed to something that is, you know, like super serious. You know, there might be some higher stakes part of it attached. To be a really low stakes activity. So just going to invite you to have a little fun with the whiteboard, or a representative from each group, and I will share the whiteboard now. So we're looking for a keyword or a doodle. If you would like to draw something on the whiteboard that represents your conversation that you had in your small breakout room. So we'll give about a minute to try this, and you can select the pens and draw something. You can select a text box if typing is easier for you or more effective for you, as well as the sticky note. And you can drag around and the board for yourself and see the writing that has come up. So lots of great comments coming up on here as I move it around, and you can see again how there is somewhat of a chaotic, exploratory nature to it, but it is kind of a fun way to see things at a glance. I see a room being drawn. Well, that's really good in real time. That's awesome. Must be an engineer. Yeah, and since we are very short on time, it looks like folks have had a chance to try it out, or at least see what it can look like. So I'm going to unshare the whiteboard, but just so you know, you can export the whiteboard and have like a PNG image of it to save for yourself, so you can refer back to it perhaps in your asynchronous classes or something like that. So here I go, sharing the presentation. So, and one way you can take this step further is to use the whiteboard to create a mind map. Now that is a little difficult with the sort of chaotic nature of the whiteboard, but there are other apps and things that you could share and kind of achieve the same type of activity that we won't be able to touch on today. There is a question in the chat about initiating the whiteboard. It's done from the screen sharing menu. Yeah, you just select the whiteboard. It's one of the windows in there you can share. Great question. So here we are arriving at the end of our presentation to go back to book ending. And a question that we often get is our scenario right now. So many great ideas come up during my synchronous sessions. Which features and platforms would allow me to create archives of my synchronous session, which I could then use to scan through and respond to my class? So again, it's really great if the things that you're doing in your synchronous session can be pulled back into that sort of asynchronous space and responded to in some way or another. So one thing you can do is you can save the chat, noting that in Teams, especially if you have a rostered team, once again, that chat lives on as part of that meeting, as part of that team for reference. But there's no sort of neat and tidy, easy way to export the chat from Teams into a document. Both WebEx and Virtual Classroom offer that sort of neat and tidy export. Additionally, there's recording. So in Teams, recordings are saved to the meeting as well as your Microsoft Stream, which you can find on your O365 site or portal.office.com. And they can be downloaded from there as MP4s for you to do what you will with. And in WebEx, recordings are saved to WebEx. So it's sort of like a WebEx account, and whether that's the Learn widget you're using or you're going back and using the full WebEx account site. And in Virtual Classroom, recordings are saved to that instance of the Learn course, and they are not as easily downloadable and reshareable beyond the course, although there are ways to do it. And then generating a transcript. So in Teams, anyone who's in your team or whom you change permissions for them to be able to see and stream can view and edit a transcript and captions within Stream. There, again, no neat and tidy way to grab that transcript and put it in a document, unfortunately, at this point. And WebEx will also generate a transcript and play it when the recording is viewed. It's also searchable, but not editable. So you won't get as accurate of a transcript as you will with Teams if you are going back to Stream and actually editing your transcript. And we just don't recommend Virtual Classroom for transcripts or closed captions because they have to be done live by a person. And that's just not as efficient, although you might have someone who would be offering to come in and to do that for you in real time. And finally, just a reminder that any work done anywhere can be saved. Even if it doesn't have a sort of obvious built-in way to save it, we just want to encourage the taking of screenshots. And screenshots will just allow you or your students to grab pictures of what they've done, and those can become artifacts and references for their work. And those things can be, you know, saved by them in a file, saved by them on a Padlet, any way, you know, in PebblePad, any way you can think of. These things can be used as sort of a record, and then again loop back into the asynchronous work they're doing for your course. So yes, we're coming to the end now, to the wrap up. I apologize for how quickly we kind of went through that last little bit. I'm gonna turn some of my attention to chat while Monica is going to share with you a really great resource for deciding how you might decide on which tools you want to use and features.
Thanks very much, Victoria. So we do recognize that this was just a top level with a couple of little dives into some of the features that you might want to explore in some of the tools that are available to us on the various platforms. A point of reference that would be very helpful to you, no doubt, is this comparison of tools for synchronous teaching table that is available at the link that I've posted in the chat. And you'll notice first, what are the actual tools that we're comparing on this table? You'll notice that WebEx has been separated into meetings and training, so those two are made distinct. MS Teams, the platform we're in here, Bongo Virtual Classroom and Learn, and we too have included Zoom because while we know it's not supported, there are certainly champions of this platform on our campus. I'm only going to highlight a couple of the different rows that might be of particular value to you. The first one I'm bringing up here is the maximum users per session, because indeed this is really critical sometimes to determining where you will land, and sometimes will predetermine for you which platform you will use. Common engagement features. I share this because this is where we spent the most of our time in this session, where Victoria and I were trying to highlight some of the distinct features of these different strategies within the platforms, because you'll notice they're available across the platforms, but they have a different flavor and they come to life in a different way in the different spots. Really very important is at the live closed captioning feature, and this is one area in which certainly Microsoft Teams excels. It is a very accurate in many ways transcription. It's quite good in contrast to many other platforms, and it also is editable after the video has been saved. So this is a really nice piece for teaching. And very important is, where do you go to get help? So there's a row that gives you both email or telephone connections to the resources that can speak to the specific platforms. But above all else, Victoria and I would like you to know that any of your faculty liaisons from CT would be very happy to answer any questions around these tools. So we hope that this sampler is just a little bit of a start for you, gives you some things to consider, some things to think about, but we definitely encourage you to pop your questions into the chat. We know we've run out of time, but if you have still outstanding questions that you'd like us to respond to, we're happy to do so in a document after this session and post it along with the recording on our website. So please don't be bashful to do that now. We're happy to take your questions, and we thank you for your time.